This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Hello, I'm Rithala Shah. Thank you for downloading the World Tonight podcast on Monday the 30th of September. On the programme, as China prepares to mark 70 years of communist rule with a display of military might, we hear views from Hong Kong and Taiwan. Also, could a prisoner released by the Houthi rebels indicate a chink of hope that Yemen's warring parties may be moving towards peace? And the BBC's reversed a decision to partially uphold a complaint against the breakfast TV presenter Naga Munchetty. We speak to an MP who'd written to the Director-General demanding a meeting. You're listening to The World Tonight with Rithala Shah. Is a Brexit breakthrough on the cards? Government sources are saying the government's prepared a legal text of an updated Brexit deal, and it's expected to make more of those plans public in the next 2 to 3 days. Well, Tony Connolly is the Brussels correspondent for RTE. Tony Connolly, what have you learnt this evening? What is it that the British government appears to be putting on the table?
Well, there are two things really to say up front. One is that we are waiting for the formal proposals from the UK government on replacing the backstop to avoid a hard border in the island of Ireland. But we've also had non-papers presented by the UK to negotiators in Brussels. Now, those papers have been a fairly closely guarded secret, but RT News has tonight got a fairly detailed briefing on one of the papers, which is the customs paper, and it talks about having customs clearance centres, which would be on both sides of the Irish border, perhaps up to 10 miles back from the border. And this is reflective of the fact that under Boris Johnson, the UK is now proposing that there would be a customs and regulatory border on the island of Ireland, whereas under Theresa May's negotiated backstop, there wouldn't have been, because Northern Ireland would, under certain circumstances, have remained part of the EU's customs territory. So the overall approach, I think, of Boris Johnson is to create a border, but then to try and manage it through technology. And what I have heard tonight, based on a fairly detailed briefing of this, is that it would come by way of these customs clearance centres on either side of the border. So he could say, well, the infrastructure isn't actually at the border, it's some way back from the border, but still traders and exporters would have to make customs declarations. The consignments going from one of these clearance centres to another on the other side of the border would be essentially tracked, monitored and so on using technology. So I think this would be a major ask for the Irish government and for the EU.
Why would it be a major ask? Because there is still infrastructure involved, albeit not literally on the border. Well,
it's important to just differentiate between Boris Johnson's approach to the Irish problem and the original backstop. The original backstop identified key problems such as preserving North-South cooperation, preserving the all-island economy, preserving the single market and no hard border. Now, the trouble is that Boris Johnson has disaggregated all of those and picked a way of creating a border but then managing it through technology. The problem for traders along the border is that it doesn't matter how technologically slick or efficient a new border is. If you are a food trader on either side of the border, trading back and forward, the customs tariffs alone will just make it unviable economically. So all of the technological wizardry is not really going to help you. And also, none of this deals with the question of North-South cooperation. It doesn't facilitate the all-island economy, which the original backstop did. So for quite a few reasons, this proposal would not really go too far in Dublin or Brussels.
But with days to go before the Brexit deadline, is it the beginning of something that could be discussed, that could be built upon to avert a no-deal Brexit?
Well, we have to wait and see, okay, because what I've been briefed on is the non-paper, which was a detailed look at how customs would be managed. It is quite possible that when the formal paper is tabled, it might be something different, but these are extremely detailed, complex issues, so it's kind of hard to see how they would produce one thing 1 week and then something entirely different a week later. But, I think if this is all Boris Johnson and the UK government are proposing as a replacement for the backstop, it's a non-starter because it does create infrastructure and it does disrupt the all-island economy.
Tony Connolly, thank you very much. Well, Senator Neil Richmond is an Irish Fine Gael politician and chair of the Senate's Brexit Committee. Neil Richmond, do you think these proposals are a non-starter, as Tony Connolly seemed to suggest?
Absolutely. I think it must be clear to mention firstly that Tony's talking about a non-paper that was shared between the British government and European officials, and what the European Commission has been quite consistent so far is that no papers that have been shared have come close to be realistic alternatives to the backstop.
A non-paper, just to explain, is a proposal, effectively, a proposal document. But it appears, though, to be providing solutions for some of the problems that everybody's been discussing endlessly, which is the idea, and it's not a complete solution, but it's part of a solution, of creating these customs clearance zones, which would be away from the border.
The joint declaration of December 17 between the British government and the European Commission quite clearly states that there'll be no additional checks or infrastructure. What these non-papers or proposals would suggest is not the protection of the Good Friday Agreement and the single market through an open border, but if anything, this doubles the border. And it would be very worrying to see these customs checks go back to, I suppose it harks back to the 70s and 80s and the era of watchtowers and a very difficult time with the Irish border. I don't think these are serious proposals, and if they are true, they're very disappointing.
But these would be buildings that would not be along the border. It wouldn't be like the 70s, would it? You're not actually literally going to have infrastructure there at the point where you cross from Northern Ireland into the Republic.
But if they're talking about within 5 miles, that's quite close to the border, and it is additional infrastructure, it is additional checks, and it is very much a retrograde step that brings us back to an older time that we all agreed that we'd move on from. It's in clear breach of the December 17 joint declaration of the British government and the European Union, and I really hope that there's more serious proposals to come.
But if these are the proposals, and we're only just getting the details now, if these are the proposals and they're rejected by the Irish government, as you're suggesting they will be, doesn't it bring the UK and Ireland closer to a no deal?
Well, it's not a matter of the Irish government. You see, this is a negotiation between the European Union as a whole with the British government, and it's the EU 27 as a whole in the European Council and our negotiator, Michel Barnier. We are moving ever closer to the 31st of October deadline. The British government has to make serious proposals. They asked for an extension back in April in order to make serious proposals. If these are the proposals, they're far from serious.
Senator Neil Richmond, thank you very much indeed. Beijing is gearing up for a big day tomorrow. 100,000 people will march through Tiananmen Square in the biggest display of military might in China's modern history. It's all to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Communist Revolution, when Chairman Mao stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace and declared a new country, the People's Republic of China. Zhu Zhende was one of the young soldiers of the People's Liberation Army who proudly marched past Chairman Mao that day.
I saw Chairman Mao and the other leaders of the country in Tiananmen Square. I was so excited and overwhelmed. I felt so optimistic. There were so many people in Tiananmen Square, you could hardly move. Every single one of us wanted to do our best and be proud of ourselves.
70 years on, China's communist rulers have defied many predictions, not only surviving but strengthening their rule. The rich and powerful China of today is unrecognisable from the country Mao took over in 1949. But there's unrest too. In Hong Kong, 4 months of increasingly violent street protests are a reminder that China's communist rulers are increasingly feared, especially on its periphery. From Hong Kong, Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reports.
Today on Tiananmen Square in Beijing, the whole of China's Communist Party leadership turned out to remember the millions who died in the long struggle to establish what they call New China. Dressed in dark suits, President Xi and the other Politburo members bowed in front of the monument to the people's heroes. This was the moment of victory. 70 years ago tomorrow, when Chairman Mao stood atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace and declared, China has stood up. The country he took over was dirt poor, ravaged by a century of almost continuous conflict. Standing on a hilltop in Hong Kong today, looking across into mainland China, that same country is unrecognisable. When I first crossed over from Hong Kong into China down there 30 years ago, on the other side, Shenzhen was just a dusty little border town. Now it is a gleaming city of 12 million people. China's transformation has been astonishing, and its people are rightly proud of their achievement. But outside of the mainland, China's new wealth and power is causing deep unease, even fear.
and nowhere more so than here in Hong Kong.
For 4 months, the streets of Hong Kong have boiled with rage. The young protesters who've taken to the streets week after week do not trust the Chinese Communist Party or its paramount leader Xi Jinping.
A lot of what's going on here in Hong Kong now seems deliberately designed to provoke the central government in Beijing. For example, I'm in a pedestrian underpass here now, one of the main ones that leads from the Old Star Ferry into central Hong Kong. And on the floor here, the protesters have pasted dozens of pictures of President Xi Jinping's face, deliberately, so that people walking through here will have to walk right across his face as they do so.
So many people, they don't like Communist Party, but
in their small flat on the south side of Hong Kong Island, David and his mother Anne sit on opposite sides of this increasingly bitter divide. David is typical of many educated young Hong Kongers.
We always say that 50 years, no changes until the 20 or 47th. But we find that the days of 2027 has come in now.
They have 200 years to build a better USA. But China only got 70 years. If better China, then with better Hong Kong. Better China, better Hong Kong.
David is among the young protesters who've now begun waving American flags and demanding the United States impose sanctions on China.
Why all the people supporting America in the trade war? Because we want the Chinese Communist parties has fallen apart because of that.
Such talk makes Hong Kong's small but noisy band of super patriots extremely angry. In a park this morning, a group of about 50 gathered, waving bright red Chinese flags and singing patriotic songs. Their leader, Po Chun-chung, says those who fear communist China have been brainwashed by their former British colonial masters.
Hong Kong was ruled by Britain for over 150 years. They did not teach us respect for our Chinese roots, but encouraged us to have anti-China and anti-communist beliefs.
On Tuesday, China's most powerful leader since Mao will review a military now second in strength only to the United States. It is a sight that will make many Chinese hearts swell with pride. But its neighbours look on with growing concern about how China will use its newfound power.
Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reporting. Well, Nathan Law is one of the student leaders who led Hong Kong's pro-democracy umbrella movement protests of 2014. I asked him what the 70th anniversary means for the territory.
Obviously, the promise of Beijing to Hong Kong, which they had made in the 1980s, promising Hong Kong to have autonomy and democracy, completely abolished. So on the day of 70th anniversary of this PRC, definitely it marked a day for Hong Kong people to fight against the totalitarianism and to do what we have to do in pursuit of our autonomy and democracy.
Many people watching the protests unfolding in Hong Kong over recent months would be asking themselves, how can this come to some kind of conclusion that is one that will satisfy the people of Hong Kong? Isn't Hong Kong truly outnumbered by China in the literal sense, but also by the sheer weight of China's economic and military clout?
The demands that Hong Kong people are asking, ultimately it leads to what Beijing has promised to us. It's just very humble request. So I do feel that is why we have a huge moral ground to continue our fights, and we are leading a global fight for the democratic values. We are fighting against the expansion of authoritarian values. So even though it seems like we're having a battle of David versus Goliath, at the end of the day, we are having the support globally, and we are winning all these supports in the international level. We are still very tenacious and we are persistent, and we hope that we could lead that fight of the global front.
But why do you think that China will yield? Hong Kong's exceptional status, its importance as a financial centre, its importance in a sense for China to do business throughout the rest of the world is declining. People would point to Shenzhen and Shanghai as now the two most important economic centres for China. Isn't that the point at which China essentially says, Hong Kong, you have to fit in now?
the world has a clear sight on China, even though they are blocking all the information, because still there are a lot of unrest. And the way that we want China to advance is not that they only do good in economic terms, but they have to become civilized in terms of how they treat their people and become more accountable to international treaties and to the world and all sorts of things. And I think it is coherent to the interest of the UK and the US and the global community. So what I mean is, even though we are asking for them to do what they have promised, we've got a huge legitimacy to urge China to not only do good for Hong Kong, but do good for themselves, their people, and the global community as a whole.
So let's throw forward. At the moment, we're marking 70 years of the Communist Party. In 2049, it'll be 100 years, a date that Xi Jinping has already flagged up. How do you imagine the status of Hong Kong then?
Well, if you look at Hong Kong tomorrow, which is on the 1st of October, the Communist Party is celebrating their 70th anniversary by locking down to the street, closing all the malls, seeing people as threats of their regime, ready to crack down heavily. And these signs are actually showing that the Communist Party is so afraid of these people, and they dare not to face the international community because they know that what they have been doing, what they have been implementing in Hong Kong is just shame for them. So on the 70th anniversary of the PRC, if you look at Hong Kong, you know how the future of the Communist Party would be.
Nathan Law. It is on China's peripheries or borders that dissent bubbles over, so Hong Kong or Xinjiang or Tibet. Taiwan's another running sore. China's claimed sovereignty over Taiwan since the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. The defeated nationalist government fled to the island as the communists swept to power. The island has, for all practical purposes, been independent since 1950, but China regards it as a rebel region that must be reunited with the mainland by force if necessary. President Xi has claimed that Taiwan will be reunited with the People's Republic by the 100th anniversary of the PRC in 2049. Brian Hughes, the editor of New Bloom, an online magazine covering youth culture and politics in Taiwan, I asked him for his reaction to that prediction.
What's interesting is that in just Xi Jinping's presidential term to date, the date for reunifying Taiwan has actually fluctuated. When can China do that is a question, because Taiwanese democracy does not seem like it's fading away anytime soon, and China faces challenges bringing Taiwan back in. Whenever Xi tries to make a policy statement on the Taiwan issue, for example, in January, when he made a speech saying that force was still on the table if Taiwan resisted attempts at unification, this actually caused an uptick of support for President Tsai Ing-wen of the more independence-leaning DPP. And so sometimes China's actions backfire in pushing Taiwan away further, in fact.
And yet, though, if you look at what China is doing on its borders, if you think about Xinjiang, if you think about Tibet, and if you look at the unrest in Hong Kong, it doesn't bode well for Taiwan.
It's a question, because I think that China itself is facing domestic instabilities. There's a slowing economy, domestic unrest, and right now it is actually a question: is does China have too much on its plate? Hong Kong seems actually like enough of a matter that Taiwan is another factor to the equation. If it actually were to become unified with China, then it would have to deal with a population that has experienced democracy and might not be happy with living under authoritarian rule. This could actually just be more than China can handle it right now.
So do you think for young people growing up in Taiwan today, that sense of a very separate identity is something clear and understood? Or is there an ambiguity there?
I think it is quite clear and understood. This generation is not one which has direct experience of China, such as their grandparents might have if they came over after the Chinese Civil War, or they don't have the nostalgia that their parents did. And so the way this generation experiences China is very different. This has coincided with the turn of China back towards authoritarianism. There was a period in which China looked like it was opening up and the economy was getting better and things were generally improving. But this has not been the case. And Hong Kong is actually a strong example of that, I think, for Taiwanese.
So tomorrow then, as the tanks roll and the celebrations unfurl and the fireworks hit the skies, will Taiwanese be largely just ignoring what's going on in China?
I think so, and that's actually the thing that is quite surprising. It is something that is a big issue for Taiwan, yet because of the fact that it does take place in what is de facto a separate country, it just won't register to as much extent as one would expect. That being said, Chinese threats, if they do offer something new or there's some new rhetoric regarding Taiwan, that might lead to reactions.
So throw forward, Brian, to 2049, the 100th anniversary. What do you think the relationship between China and Taiwan will be like then?
That's the funny thing. If the status quo preserves, then I think there is actually no hope of unification at all. By that point, there will be even further separation between China and Taiwan culturally, politically, and so forth, that there would just be no way of unifying them. It's a question then. I think that even now the current administration, the Tsai administration, may be actually just hoping to prolong the de facto independence of Taiwan from China, or to preserve the certain status quo that exists now, because of the fact that this will become more and more permanent as time goes on. And so China itself is working under a deadline in that sense to reunify Taiwan, because if it just waits too long, then these chances will just recede even further into the distance, I think.
Taiwanese journalist Brian Hugh. Racism is racism, and the BBC is not impartial on the topic. The verdict of the BBC's Director General, Lord Hall, who has tonight reversed a decision to partially uphold a complaint against breakfast presenter Naga Munchetty. In an email, Tony Hall told staff he personally reviewed the decision and concluded that Naga Munchetty's words were not sufficient to merit a partial uphold of the complaint against her. The BBC had originally found she'd criticised the US president's motives in saying 4 female Democrats should go back to places from which they came. Well, the journalist and former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Trevor Phillips, criticised the guidelines that led to the decision in the first place.
They seem to be operating in a way that say to black or Asian or minority BBC staff, once you come in here, you must leave all that you have grown up with, all that has informed your personality and your knowledge and your culture behind you at the door. That cannot be right. We do not expect that of other journalists. We do not expect people simply to become automatons. The BBC has to say that it believes in diversity, and not just the picture of diversity, but the reality of it.
Well, the Labour MP Seema Malhotra is one of 100 MPs who've written to Tony Hall asking for a meeting to discuss the original decision made by the Complaints Unit. And she's on the line now. Good evening.
Good evening.
Seema Malhotra, are you satisfied now that Lord Hall's reversed that decision?
I do welcome the response by Lord Hall and the comments that he has made about the BBC not being impartial on the topic of racism. But it is surprising that it has come 5 days after the story broke and after a weekend which saw the BBC resist calls for a review of the decision. It's been an absolutely unprecedented outcry from the public, from politicians and BBC staff with that bewilderment, and especially as I think Naga Munchetty is known as an utter professional with great integrity. I think what's going to be important now is to recognise that this happened for a reason, and there are questions now about the BBC's current procedures and processes, and also about the complexity of these issues and how we handle them. And I very much hope that they will take this opportunity to undertake a review of their guidelines, perhaps with the advice of the EHRC as well.
Is this a question of rethinking what impartiality means in certain contexts?
I think it's a question of understanding how the world is changing. You know, arguably, Naga's contribution was extremely insightful and informative in the context in which it was made. And I think to many viewers, her comments were quite balanced. They were even tweeted by BBC Breakfast itself. And there is a wider debate about rising Islamophobia, wider racism. This also happened in the week in which I think the public debate started to shift. It certainly did in Parliament, about the impact of language being used by senior politicians, even with the daughter of Yvette Cooper writing incredibly powerfully about the impact of security measures at home and threats to families on the children. These are voices we're not normally hearing. So I do think it is going to be extremely important that we think differently now about how institutions respond to this growing threat and the growing language and the growing rise of hate crime.
I sometimes joke about, as a BBC presenter, you have your opinion chip taken out of you. But of course, the reality is everybody has their opinions. You try not to show them on air. But is there a change in the way we understand what it means to be impartial?
Well, I think there is definitely a change in this sense, that we absolutely recognise the need for impartiality and professionalism at all times, and we absolutely expect that. And we would understand the importance, I think we all would, of the BBC and other media outlets having guidelines in these circumstances. But this was also a time when there was a contribution made by a presenter who herself had been a victim and experienced racism, who gave a perspective on a story that was insightful. If that was seen as expressing an opinion that went too far, well, I do think it starts to question the guidance that there is at the moment and how institutions respond to what is a challenge and a threat to all of us and to our country.
Seema Malhotra, thank you very much. The headlines so far on The World Tonight. Reports from Ireland say Britain is proposing to set up customs clearance centres which will be set back from the Irish border as part of a new Brexit deal. The Irish government has said it hasn't received any credible proposals from the British. A UK government source said its proposals wouldn't involve any checks or controls at the border. Almost 300 prisoners have been freed by Houthi rebels in Yemen as part of an international peace initiative agreed in Sweden in December. It's a sliver of good news in a conflict which has pitted the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels against a Saudi-led coalition. The fighting and bombardment has left the country in the midst of one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in the world. Thousands have been killed and 24 million Yemenis are in need of humanitarian assistance. The escalation of the war in Yemen coincided with the rise of Saudi Arabia's now de facto leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS. But over the past 5 years, the conflict's heightened tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran and has now drifted into violent deadlock. Speaking to Nora O'Donnell on CBS News, MBS appeared to offer talks for a political solution to the civil war.
First, if Iran stops its support of the Houthi militia, the political solution will be much easier. Today we open all initiatives for a political solution in Yemen. We hope this happens today rather than tomorrow.
You're saying tonight that you want to negotiate an end to the war in Yemen?
We are doing this every day. But we try to turn this discussion into an actual implementation on the ground. And the Houthis, a few days ago, announced a ceasefire from their side. We consider it a positive step to push for more serious and active political dialogue.
MBS. Well, if a negotiated deal is to succeed, it'll need compromise on both sides. And perhaps the release of the prisoners by the Houthis might hint at that possibility. The newly freed men streamed out of the gates of Sana's central prison, many cheering and pausing to kneel and kiss the ground. These former prisoners were overjoyed to be granted freedom.
It's been a year and a half, and our feelings today are indescribable. This is a very good initiative, and we hope that all parties can take similar initiatives and release all the prisoners.
We suffered in prison, and today I feel at peace because of my release. It's such a joy.
The International Committee of the Red Cross said among those released were dozens of survivors from a Saudi-led airstrike on a detention centre earlier this month, which left more than 100 people dead. Natalie Bekdash is a spokesperson for the ICRC in Aden, and she too expressed that this release might signal a move towards peace.
We were asked to play the role of a neutral facilitator, and today we facilitated the release operation of 290 detainees, all Yemenis. We hope that there are more release operations, and we do hope that this release does open the door for future releases, bigger releases from all sides, and we hope also that it revives the Stockholm Agreement and that this agreement gets implemented, and that this particular release, and of course if future releases happen, also open the door for a political solution to this conflict, which is absolutely necessary to happen given the humanitarian crisis that Yemen is going through, which we can only really describe as catastrophic.
Well, the Stockholm Agreement mentioned by Natalie Bekdash was brokered in the Swedish capital in December. A prisoner swap was one of 3 elements of the agreement between the warring parties. So could today's release mark a step towards peace in Yemen? Annika Söder is Sweden's State Secretary to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and she was directly involved in the Stockholm Agreement talks, and she joins me now. Good evening.
Good evening.
Annika Söder, how significant is this release? Is it for you a sign of real progress?
very significant. As you said, it constitutes one of the three more important parts of the Stockholm Agreement. And after several months of stalemate and even moving backwards on the port of Hodeida, which is another situation that is involved in the Stockholm Agreement, this is a very, very positive sign. And we welcome this. There is more to do when it comes to prisoners, but I'm sure that the ICRC did its utmost and that it can do more, and that the UN envoy Martin Griffiths can now build on this when it comes to taking steps forwards also on the other aspects of this shameful conflict.
The Saudi Crown Prince in that interview that we heard a clip from also appeared to offer talks for a political solution to the civil war in Yemen. To what extent do you think there is a weariness on all sides?
Of course there is a weariness, and nobody can win this war, and the big victim is of course the Yemeni people, and I'm very happy if this is now more realized on all sides. I take it that many contacts have been taken during the last month that have proven to be more positive. Maybe also the increased tensions around the Hormuz Strait and the tensions between Iran and the United States play in here. They can, of course, play in negatively, but I really hope that it can play in a positive fashion, because this region and the people of this region, they deserve better.
So do you think there could be more talks on the horizon? Is there any evidence for that?
There are contacts ongoing. The envoy is in close touch with all the parties involved, the coalition, the Emirates and Saudi Arabia part of the coalition, and with the Yemeni government and with the Houthis. And I'm sure that with this important gesture and also the ceasefire proclaimed between the Houthis, or by the Houthis as regards to missiles against Saudi Arabia, are very, very positive steps. And I hope that the entire pattern around the Persian Gulf will change now. This is also in the interest of all of us that are neighbours, including the European countries.
Well, do you think that attack on the Saudi Arabian oil facilities earlier this month, which was attributed by Washington and indeed the Saudis to the Iranians, has in a sense perhaps focused minds on the dangers posed to both sides as this essentially proxy war escalates between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
We have seen escalation both when it comes to rhetoric and when it comes to sanctions and other activities by all the actors that are involved around the situation in Iran, the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula, and all of the situations are closely interlinked. It's very difficult to tell if this attack made actors realize better what is at stake. But if it did so, it's a very unfortunate attack, but if it did so, we are more than grateful for all the parties taking their role very seriously and moving towards peace, because what this region needs is collaboration and security guarantees and arrangements, not increasing the tensions that are already very dangerous.
Annika Soda, thank you very much indeed.
At the third stroke, it will be 1:59 and 10 seconds.
Au quatrième top, il sera 17h18. CNRC, temps universel coordonné, 12h17 et 30 secondes. At the third stroke, it will be 3:26 and 40 seconds.
That's the sound of the speaking clock from around the world. In the UK, the speaking clock is still very much alive and ticking. But Australia, which we heard at the end there, is waking up to a world without a service it called George. The Aussies have decided the speaking clock is past its time and have pulled the plug. Australians will no longer be able to call up a reassuring voice to tell them the exact time at the third stroke. Sara Mendes da Costa was the fourth voice of the British speaking clock between 2007 to 2016. I asked her how she prepared for that very important role.
They were looking for somebody to be warm and trustworthy and friendly and to offer a voice that they could trust to tell you the right time. And so I was kind of mindful of the criteria. And at the same time, I wanted to be kind of relaxed and do a good job as me.
It was 2007, I think, when you were recording this. Why do you think people still wanted to use a speaking clock?
Well, gosh, at that time, smartphones weren't around in the same way. I think there was more of a need to have the time than perhaps there is now. And also it's a huge part of our culture. It's a massive historical icon, if you like.
So sentimental attachment, I think, is what you're saying. I mean, Australia's ending their service.
I know. I feel so sad for them. I really do. I mean, it is such a huge part of everybody's cultures. People really have relied on this, model of timekeeping. In the time of Pat Simmons, the second speaking clock, at one point I think there was something like 300 million calls to the speaking clock in 1 year. So that's a huge necessity, and also, as you say, a part of our hearts, I think, is fair to say.
Did anyone recognise your voice after you'd been the speaking clock?
They did, to a degree. I did have people, certainly when I was on the TV and on the radio a lot, people whispering and going red and talking very quietly on their tables. One of the funniest things was when I was in Boots the Chemist and I gave my Boots card and they went, "Are you the speaking clock?" And I was like, funnily enough, yes, I am. So they recognised my name because it's a bit of a long one.
Does it still define you? Is it one of those things you can never really let go?
To a degree, yes. I think there is a large part of me where I will never leave it behind. Obviously, people still talk to me about it. I still get interviewed about it and people want to hear about it. But yes, I think you don't do such a long stint as something like the speaking clock without it being part of you. So yes, in some ways it does identify me.
Sara Mendes da Costa on the joys of the speaking clock, which Australia's now abandoned. Tonight's closing headline. Senior government sources have told the BBC ministers have prepared a legal text of an updated Brexit deal, and it's expected to make more of the plans public in the next 2 to 3 days. The proposals involve creating customs clearance zones in Northern Ireland and the Republic, but sources say the checks won't be at the border. Neil Richmond chairs the Brexit Committee in the Irish Senate. He told us the proposals were disappointing.
If anything, this doubles the border, and it would be very worrying to see these customs checks go back to, I suppose it harks back to the 70s and 80s and the era of watchtowers and a very difficult time with the Irish border.
Elsewhere, Hong Kong's bracing itself for more violent demonstrations tomorrow as China marks the 70th anniversary of communist rule, and the BBC's reversed its decision to uphold a complaint against the presenter Naga Munchetty over her criticism of a racist tweet by Donald Trump. Don't forget, you can email us. Our address is world.tonight@bbc.co.uk. That is The World Tonight. I'm Ritula Shah. For now, from me and everyone on the programme, good night.